On July 2nd, 1944, Cherbourg, France, the mouth of the underground hospital gaped like a wound in the hillside, its breath damp and cold. Dr. Schwester emerged first, hands lifted, white coat fluttering against the summer wind. For a moment, the sun blinded her. After weeks in darkness, daylight felt like an assault. Behind her, 8 other nurses followed in silence, faces drawn, uniforms stiff with the scent of ether and smoke. Hours earlier, huddled near the last sputtering lantern, she had whispered her certainty to the others. The Americans can't have what they claim. It's all lies to weaken us. Even now, as she stepped onto the ruined road, that certainty clung to her like ash. The nurses had spent their final days beneath Cherbourg's fortress, treating shattered soldiers with little more than boiling water, reused bandages, and stubborn faith in their cause. Their candles burned low, their morphine nearly gone. The rumble of artillery had been replaced by the low hum of American engines and the metallic click of unfamiliar boots. The first thing Schwester noticed wasn't the fin at the rifles. It was the convoy of ambulances waiting in the sunlight. Clean, ordered, quiet. A young American medic, no older than her youngest patient, met her gaze without malice. She expected scorn. Instead, he spoke evenly. "We'll take it from here." The air smelled different, above ground, disinfectant, gasoline, fresh bread from a nearby field kitchen. Within hours, these 9 women would step inside a medical facility unlike anything they had ever imagined. They would see crates stacked with supplies. Their army had rationed for months. Instruments gleamed in polished trays. Bandages were used once, then thrown away. Penicillin, rumored but never touched, was stored as casually as sugar. For now, they stood motionless, blinking into the light, unaware that this moment was the beginning of their undoing. What they believed, unshakable, German superiority, the righteousness of their cause, was already crumbling beneath the steady hum of American logistics. The war hadn't ended for them, but something inside had begun to fracture. May 13th, 1943, Tunisia. The desert wind swept across the surrender grounds, carrying the metallic rattle of stacked rifles and the heavy silence of defeat. The sun bore down mercilessly on thousands of German prisoners, among them doctors, orderlies, and Red Cross nurses who had served in Rommel's Afrika Korps. They had been trained to see themselves as the best in Europe, precise, disciplined, superior. What awaited them beyond the front lines would shake that belief at its roots. Ilse Schultz adjusted the band around her cap as she marched with the others toward the collection point. She had earned the Iron Cross just weeks earlier, patching together young men with nothing but bare hands and thread. She had believed then, as she did every day, that sacrifice proved righteousness. Now, the ground beneath that certainty felt thin. Rows of American medics moved through the dust with a calm that unnerved her. No chaos, no shouting. They carried stainless steel trays wrapped in waxed cloth, instruments gleaming in the sun. When a wounded German officer stumbled, an American medic caught him, not roughly, but with practiced efficiency. The gesture was small. It was also unforgivable to everything she'd been taught. "They have more supplies in a single truck than we see in a month," Greta Falk murmured beside her. She wasn't exaggerating. Sulfa powder, precious like gold in the field, was poured into wounds without hesitation. Bandages were replaced without boiling. Even the waste spoke volumes. Buckets filled with discarded dressings were carried away like refuse. To German nurses used to counting every grain of powder, it was unthinkable. As the captured medical personnel were sorted for processing, Schultz realized something far more dangerous than defeat was happening. This wasn't just military loss. It was the unraveling of a myth. Everything she'd heard about American weakness, about their lack of discipline, dissolved under the weight of abundance. When an American officer ordered medical exams for the captured nurses, the shock deepened. Equipment that hadn't existed in her field hospitals appeared as standard issue. Functional X-rays, clean syringes, fresh gloves. It wasn't arrogance on their faces. It was quiet capability. That day in the desert, the wind carried more than sand. It carried the first quiet fracture in the ideology she'd built her life upon. The Liberty ship groaned as it cut through the Atlantic swells, its steel hull humming like a living thing. Ilse Schultz stood at the railing in a borrowed coat, salt winds stinging her eyes. Behind her, rows of captured German nurses huddled in silence, watching the endless water stretch toward a country they had been raised to despise. On the day of their boarding, they had expected the journey to mirror the squalor of the front. Instead, they stepped into an organized machine. The ship's medical bay, tucked below deck, was a revelation. Stainless tables, electric lights that never flickered, and refrigeration units filled with medicine, plasma, penicillin, even painkillers they hadn't seen in months. Everything they'd been taught about American weakness evaporated with the click of a switch. In the wards, American nurses moved with quiet confidence, their uniforms immaculate. When a German orderly was brought in with a festering wound, an American medic applied sulfa powder liberally, then disposed of the dressing as if it meant nothing. Schultz watched in disbelief. In Africa, that amount could have treated 3 men. Meals were another shock. Fresh bread, meat, fruit. Things Schultz hadn't tasted since the early days of the war. American crew left plates unfinished, scraping food into bins to a German nurse who'd watched patients starve for lack of rations. The casual waste was almost obscene. At night, the lights stayed on in the corridors. Machines thrummed steadily. There was no flicker of oil lamps, no damp ceilings, no desperate improvisation. The ship felt less like a transport of prisoners and more like a floating factory of efficiency. It wasn't kindness that unsettled her most. It was competence. From the deck, Schultz caught her first glimpse of the American coast days later, cranes stretching toward the sky, harbors pulsing with movement. Trains waited, already loaded. Trucks rolled out in formation. She realized with a sharp breath that this was not a struggling nation. It was an empire of organization. What she saw in those final miles toward Norfolk wasn't just the end of a journey. It was the beginning of understanding what they were truly up against. Not only an enemy army, but an entire medical system built on power they had been taught did not exist. The train slowed with a long metallic sigh as it pulled into the camp station in Alabama. From the windows, Ilse Schultz saw neat white buildings arranged in precise rows, their roofs gleaming under the heat. The air smelled faintly of pine, soap, and something else she hadn't smelled in months: sterility. Campo Pellica was nothing like the grim images Nazi propaganda had painted of American prison camps. There were no muddy ditches, no starving prisoners behind barbed wire. Instead, the hospital complex rose like a small, self-contained city. Wards, laboratories, operating rooms, and rows of warehouses stacked with supplies. The German medical personnel were processed not like criminals, but like professionals. A nurse with sun-browned skin and clear, calm eyes handed Schultz a medical form written in precise English. "Routine health check," she said. "No scorn, no threat, just efficiency." Inside the ward, Schultz paused. Electric lights hummed overhead, bright and steady. Operating tables gleamed. Instruments lay in orderly trays wrapped in cloth. A sterilizer hissed softly in the corner. It wasn't grandiosity that struck her. It was the absolute normality of abundance. American medical officers supervised the wards, but the patients, German prisoners, were being treated by their own captured staff. Under Geneva Convention protocols, the Americans allowed them to work. Schultz found herself assigned to a post-op recovery room alongside a young American nurse. Their eyes met over a patient's bandaged chest, and for a heartbeat, the war felt far away. Scalpel turnovers every 48 hours, the American said casually. Schultz blinked. 48 hours. Back home, they'd re-sterilize the same tools until they dulled. Here, the equipment rotated like clockwork. The dual-staff system blurred lines that had once seemed unshakable. German nurses worked under American oversight, but with unexpected trust. They weren't ordered, they were directed. No shouting, no barking of rank, just clear expectations and resources to meet them. That night, Schultz lay awake on a clean cot, listening to the distant hum of generators keeping the hospital alive. The sound was steady, reassuring, terrifying. She had walked into a world where medicine didn't bend beneath scarcity. The walls of ideology she'd grown up with weren't shattering in one blow. They were dissolving quietly, one clean hallway, one stainless tray at a time. The first time Ilse Schultz saw penicillin used, she thought it was a demonstration, something staged to impress prisoners. A young German soldier, his legs swollen from infection, was wheeled into the ward in a German field hospital. This would have been an amputation. Here, an American doctor calmly uncapped a vial, checked the dosage, and delivered the injection with practiced ease. No drama, no hesitation. Within 3 days, the fever broke. Within a week, the wound began to close. Schultz watched each change like someone witnessing sorcery. In her world, gangrene was a sentence. Here, it was a treatable condition. Penicillin wasn't rationed. It flowed like water. Cabinets held dozens of vials. Technicians recorded their use in neat columns, as though this miracle were nothing more than routine paperwork. Schultz ran her fingers along a box once, cold glass, crisp labels. She remembered months of losing men for want of a few milligrams. Then came the blood plasma. She'd been trained to perform direct transfusions in the field, a dangerous practice that too often ended in death. But in the American system, bags of preserved plasma hung from steel stands, labeled, stored, and ready. Type O, AB, A neatly arranged, like library books. Cross-matching was precise. No hurried guesses, no desperate prayers. The nurses also noticed something else they could not reconcile: the presence of black nurses working with authority. Military segregation had assigned them to prisoner wards, but their competence was undeniable. Lieutenant Ellen Powell moved through the ward with steady confidence, issuing instructions that even senior German nurses followed. Schultz could feel the tension in the room, the silent collapse of everything they had been told about racial hierarchy. The American medics didn't boast. They didn't need to. Their technology, their organization, and their quiet assurance did the talking. Schultz found herself touching her badge one evening. The Red Cross insignia faded with wear, and realizing it no longer symbolized what she once believed. The war had taught her to fear bullets, shells, and bombs, but this rows of vials, sterilized steel, calm precision, was something far more dangerous to everything she thought was true. Not a weapon, but a cure. And it was winning. In December 1943, arrived, not with the sound of bombs, but with the smell of cinnamon and the faint echo of carols drifting through the camp loudspeakers. Schultz stood near the wire fence, breath turning white in the cold, as American volunteers carried boxes into the barracks. Christmas, something she had assumed would pass in bitter silence, was arriving anyway. The Red Cross parcels came first, neatly wrapped packages with chocolate, soap, cigarettes, and writing paper. Schultz held the small bar of chocolate in her hands for several minutes before unwrapping it. She hadn't tasted real chocolate in years. Around her, the other nurses exchanged uneasy glances, unsure if this generosity was genuine or a trap. Then came the singing. A church group from a nearby town stood outside the fence, their voices rising into the crisp night air, singing Still an Act in German. American children clutched handmade cards and passed them through the wire, grinning with the unguarded innocence of people who had never seen the inside of a battlefield hospital. The mess hall was transformed that night. Long tables groaned under the weight of turkey, potatoes, bread, and steaming coffee. No lectures, no leaflets, no propaganda, just food. Schultz sat stiffly at first, waiting for the cruelty she'd been conditioned to expect. It never came. What unsettled her most wasn't the abundance, it was the kindness. These people, the enemy, were sharing their holidays with those who had fought to destroy them. For a woman raised on the idea of merciless struggle, it was an unbearable contradiction. Later in her bunk, Schultz stared at the small card a child had handed her, a shaky drawing of a Christmas tree, and a single word written in clumsy German, Frieden, peace. The soft hum of generators and distant carols blended into the winter night. It wasn't the war that kept her awake. It was the quiet, disarming kindness of her captors. That night, something inside her shifted, not with noise or argument, but with the quiet certainty that cruelty had not won. The first lecture began in a plain wooden building that smelled faintly of chalk and winter rain. Rows of German nurses, still wearing their faded Red Cross uniforms, sat on hard benches as an American physician wrote on the board with deliberate strokes. Medicine serves life, or it serves power. For Schultz, lectures had always meant memorization and obedience. In the Reich's training halls, there were no questions, only rules. But here, the American instructor didn't command. He invited, "If you disagree," he said, setting the chalk down. "Say so, that's how science grows." The words felt foreign, almost dangerous. The classes covered subjects Schultz had heard only in whispers: medical ethics, patient rights, infectious disease control, new surgical techniques. Each lesson was grounded in method, not ideology. Instead of racial theory charts, they were shown X-rays and case studies. Instead of lectures on hereditary purity, they learned about universal care and data. At first, most of the German nurses sat in stiff silence, but slowly the room began to thaw. A question here, a cautious comment there. Greta Falk, who had once repeated propaganda with iron certainty, surprised even herself when she challenged an American nurse on a procedure, not out of defiance, but curiosity. The American smiled and explained in careful, patient English. No shouting, no humiliation, just conversation. The shift was subtle, but seismic. Schultz had lived in a system where asking the wrong question could end a career. Here, questions built trust. Between lectures, the nurses were allowed access to medical journals, many authored by scientists their regime had exiled or persecuted. Realizing that their supposed enemies had produced the very knowledge they lacked was like stepping into cold water. It shocked the breath from their lungs. By the end of the first month, the classroom no longer felt like an obligation, it felt like an opening. Some still clung to their training, their loyalty. Others, like Schultz, began to understand that the world outside their ideology was wider and far more advanced than they had ever imagined. It was not bombs or interrogations that began to undo them. It was blackboards, open doors, and the right to ask why. July 1945, Bari, Italy. The hospital tent flaps snapped in the wind as stretcher teams rushed another wave of wounded through the entrance. Schultz wiped her hands against the crisp white apron she'd been issued by the U.S. Army. A year earlier, she would have bristled at the sight of the stars and stripes stitched on its edge. She moved through the ward with steady steps, checking pulse lines, adjusting plasma drips, preparing instruments. The patient on her table wore a German uniform, his face pale beneath the bloodied bandages. The surgeon next to her was American. Orders passed between them, not in ideology but in clipped, precise medical terms. There was no triumph here, no theater. Just the relentless rhythm of war medicine. Schultz had been assigned to this Allied field hospital as part of the POW medical program. Under American supervision, German nurses were integrated into the staff not as prisoners chained to their posts, but as professionals expected to perform. She'd learned to work with equipment she once only saw in textbooks: autoclaves, sterilized instruments in minutes. Suction pumps replaced hand-pumped jars. Adjustable beds made patient care faster, safer. Greta Falk assisted at the next table, her hands steady as she prepared sutures. Months ago, she would have hesitated. Now, she moved with a quiet confidence born not of orders, but of competence. The strangest part wasn't the equipment, it was the cooperation. Italian civilians lay in beds beside Allied soldiers, German prisoners beside Americans. The same antibiotics, the same plasma, the same care. Schultz didn't like to think of it as betrayal, though a part of her still flinched at the thought. But as she watched the American surgeon nod in silent thanks when she caught a slipping clamp, she understood something fundamental. Medicine was bigger than the war. The enemy she had imagined was no longer a faceless threat. He was the man she worked beside, the patient she treated, the life she saved. Spring 1945. The projectors filled the lecture hall like a heartbeat. The lights dimmed, and the first grainy black and white images flickered onto the canvas sheet. Ilse Schultz sat rigid, hands locked on her knees, as the footage unfolded. She had treated soldiers, civilians, prisoners, but nothing had prepared her for this. The camera panned across rows of emaciated bodies, skeletal faces staring blankly at the sky. Allied medics moved through the camps with masks over their mouths, stepping over corpses as they carried survivors to stretchers. A child, barely breathing, blinked against the sunlight like someone emerging from another world. The narrator's voice, calm, clinical, described the systematic starvation and medical experiments that had turned hospitals into instruments of death. Schultz's lungs felt tight. She had heard whispers during the war, rumors dismissed as enemy lies. They had always told themselves their work was separate, pure, healers, not executioners. But the images made that lie shatter like glass. Around her, the other German nurses stared at the screen in silence. Some covered their mouths. Others looked away. No one spoke. The sound of distant generators outside only sharpened the terrible stillness inside. The footage ended with a close-up of a medical cart stacked with instruments, similar to the ones they used every day. Ordinary tools, ordinary hands, extraordinary cruelty. An American officer stepped forward. "Medicine can serve ideology," he said quietly, "or it can serve life. You have seen what happens when it serves the wrong master." No shouts, no accusations. Just the undeniable weight of truth. That night, Schultz sat alone outside the barracks, staring at her hands, the same hands that had stitched wounds, carried morphine, wrapped bandages. They had not done what she'd seen on screen, but they had served the system that did. The war was ending, but the silence inside her was only beginning. By summer 1945, Schultz no longer flinched at the rows of cabinets filled with supplies, but the awe never fully left her. Every shelf, every drawer seemed to overflow bandages, glass syringes, antiseptics, plasma units, penicillin vials stacked like sugar cubes. It wasn't luxury, it was standard. American hospitals operated like finely tuned machines. Instruments were replaced at the first hint of wear, medications discarded after expiration, not stretched, not hoarded. It was a rhythm she had never known in German wards, where scarcity defined every decision and improvisation was the only constant. But what shook her most wasn't the abundance. It was the structure behind it. American nurses worked as professionals, not as silent assistants. They gave input, corrected junior doctors, made decisions without waiting for orders. Captain Helen Morrison, a senior surgical nurse, had said it plainly: "You're responsible for the patient. If something's wrong, you speak up. Rank doesn't silence you here." For Schultz, raised in a rigid hierarchy where questioning a physician bordered on insubordination, those words were almost unthinkable. And yet, in these wards, They were lived reality. Another contradiction came in the form of Lieutenant Ellen Powell, the black nurse who ran one of the prisoner wards. In Nazi ideology, a woman like her was supposed to be inferior. But here, Powell commanded authority and skill Schultz couldn't deny. She moved through rounds like a storm of calm precision, instructing German nurses with confidence that silenced any doubt. Schultz watched her once correct an American junior doctor without hesitation, and the doctor listened. The Reich had told Schultz who was superior and who was not. This ward told her something entirely different. Late one night, as she restocked the supply cabinet, Schultz found herself whispering, "They don't win because they have more. They win because they built it better." She wasn't talking about tanks or planes. She was talking about medicine. The abundance was not accidental. It was deliberate, structured, shared across color lines her world had sworn could never be crossed. That truth was more destabilizing than any defeat on the battlefield. The war had stripped everything down to essentials: skill, will, and survival. Yet, in the American hospitals, Schultz saw something she never expected: openness. The kind that didn't ask who you were before it shared what it knew. Training sessions were held twice a week under canvas roofs or in converted barracks. American officers demonstrated surgical techniques, sanitation protocols, new drug regimens. The German nurses sat shoulder to shoulder with captured orderlies, listening, taking notes. No one demanded loyalty. No oaths, just the expectation to learn. Greta Falk excelled in these sessions, surprising even herself. Back home, advancement required political approval. Here, skill spoke louder than ideology. When she asked questions, instructors answered. When she made a mistake, they corrected without mockery. The logic was simple. Better nurses meant more lives saved. Schultz learned burn treatments developed in the Pacific campaigns, new triage methods from Normandy, infection control protocols she hadn't imagined were possible in field conditions. Every procedure came with explanation, not command. It was medicine as shared craft, not weapon. She also noticed something else. Italian medical staff, once enemies too, now walked freely across the wards. Cooperation had earned them privileges that strict loyalty to the Reich had denied. It was a brutal but clear lesson in this world. Usefulness mattered more than slogans. One afternoon, Schultz assisted in a complex abdominal surgery led by an American captain. When it was over, he handed her the suture kit and said, "You've got good hands." She'd expected a sneer, not respect. The simple acknowledgement cut deeper than any speech. Ideology had drawn lines between us and them, but every lesson, every shared instrument, erased a little more of that line. The war ended not with cheers, but with quiet orders. One by one, the nurses were processed for return. Schultz stood in a crowded assembly hall as an American officer spoke with the same steady tone she'd heard in operating rooms. "You're going home to a country that will need you more than ever. You're going home to a country that will need you more than ever." Germany was in ruins. Everyone knew it. Cities flattened, hospitals burned, epidemics waiting like wolves at the door. But unlike soldiers returning empty-handed, these nurses carried something invisible but powerful: knowledge. For weeks before departure, they attended concentrated courses that stripped away the frills and focused on survival medicine, public health, epidemic control, clean water, mass vaccination, improvised clinics. Schultz learned how to set up a functioning ward with nothing but canvas, soap, and grit. American instructors drilled them with precision. The first hour saves the most lives. Build fast. Build clean. Don't wait for perfect. They weren't lectured about ideology or guilt. They were taught how to keep people alive. Certificates were handed out in the final week. Plain paper, simple ink, stamped with U.S. Army Medical Corps seals. To Schultz, That paper weighed more than any medal she had received in uniform. It wasn't a decoration, it was a key. At night, she lay on her bunk, listening to the distant whistle of trains being prepared for transport. For the first time in years, the future didn't feel like a battlefield. It felt like a long, difficult road that she might actually help rebuild. When the day of departure came, they boarded in silence. Behind them lay clean wards, humming generators, endless shelves of supplies. Ahead lay shattered hospitals, crowded refugee camps, and a population clinging to survival. Schultz gripped her certificate tightly. She knew she wasn't the same woman who had entered captivity. The Americans hadn't tried to convert her with speeches or punishment. They had shown her a different way to heal, and expected her to carry it forward. The war had taken everything, but it had left her with something that could build again. When Schultz stepped off the train into the broken skeleton of her city, it barely resembled the place she'd left. Buildings leaned like tired men. Hospital wings were burned-out shells, but the greatest absence was invisible: supplies, order, hope. She walked into the remains of the local clinic and found a single cot, a cracked basin, and a handful of worn bandages. Yet she didn't falter. She began to rebuild the only way she knew how, the way she had learned in captivity. Within months, makeshift wards turned into organized spaces. Training circles formed around Schultz and other returning nurses. They passed on the techniques drilled into them by American instructors: proper sterilization, field surgery efficiency, triage systems, patient advocacy. What had once been enemy knowledge became a lifeline for their own people. Across occupied Germany, similar stories unfolded. Former POW nurses opened small training programs, some in bombed-out classrooms, others in converted church halls. What spread wasn't just practical skill, it was a philosophy: medicine as service, not as an instrument of ideology. Hospitals slowly adopted blood banking systems modeled after those the nurses had seen in the U.S. Penicillin. Once mythical, became a standard. Charts and protocols replaced guesswork. For the first time, nurses began to work with a new sense of professional identity, not just as obedient hands, but as active partners in care. By 1950, Schultz passed under the stone archway of a new nursing school that bore no political symbols, only the Red Cross and a single motto on the wall: for life, not for power. She touched the cold surface of the plaque, remembering the steel trays, the bright lights, the lessons in English. The war had ended, but its echoes carried forward, not through speeches, but through every healed wound and every life saved. Half a century after the war, the room smelled faintly of disinfectant and rain. The nurses were old now, faces lined, hands slower, voices softer, but their memories were clear. A small recorder clicked on, and Schultz leaned forward, the weight of years in her gaze. "We arrived as prisoners," she began, "and left as witnesses." Around her sat a handful of women who had shared that strange, disorienting captivity. Some had spent only months in American hospitals. Others, like Greta Falk, had stayed for years. All carried the same indelible mark: the memory of a medical system that had undone their certainties without firing a shot. Ilse's voice didn't tremble. She spoke of endless rows of plasma bottles glinting under electric light, of surgeries that saved limbs her own army would have amputated, of the quiet dignity of African American nurses whose competence shattered her prejudice more thoroughly than any speech could have. "We thought strength came from power," she said. "But it came from care." Another nurse, her hands folded on her lap, added, "They didn't need to lecture us, they showed us." Heads nodded around the room. Even after all those years, they still remembered the smell of sterilized steel, the hum of generators, the warmth of strangers who treated enemies like patients. Their statement, drafted and signed that day, would later be archived in a medical history collection. We served a regime that taught medicine to divide. In American hospitals, we saw medicine used to heal. They gave us no speeches, no slogans. Only proof. We learned that true medical power is not domination, but compassion. The last line was underlined twice. When the session ended, Schultz remained seated for a long while. Outside, distant ambulance sirens echoed through a peaceful city, rebuilt from rubble. She had spent her life teaching young nurses what she had learned in captivity, that a bandage can build more than a wall, and a kind hand can defeat an empire's lie. July 2nd, 1944, a group of 9 nurses had emerged from a cave hospital in Normandy, blinking against the daylight they hadn't seen in days. They were exhausted, proud, and convinced of their nation's superiority. What they could not have known then was that their surrender marked the beginning of something far larger than captivity. It was the start of an education that would outlive the war itself. What defeated them was not bullets. It was penicillin. It was clean wards, humming generators, and an endless line of plasma bottles. It was the quiet confidence of nurses who could question doctors, of black professionals leading wards, of a system that healed without asking who deserved it. Through months and years in American care, their worldview cracked open. They witnessed a country that didn't hoard its knowledge, but shared it, where enemy nurses were not humiliated, but trained, where medical power came not from domination but abundance, and from the belief that every life was worth saving. Schultz's transformation mirrored that of thousands of others. She had arrived a product of rigid hierarchy and racial ideology. She left a nurse who understood that healing didn't wear a uniform. She carried back to Germany not propaganda but protocols, not slogans but procedures. The Americans had fought with guns, yes, but they conquered with medicine. The ripple spread silently. Hospitals rebuilt in the ashes of war bore the fingerprints of their captives' education. Nursing schools adopted American standards, blood banks, sterilization methods, emergency protocols, patient advocacy, all carried home in the notebooks and memories of the defeated. It wasn't a program of conversion. It was the unshakable power of proof. Decades later, Schultz could still remember the first time she saw a plasma bag catch the light. How something so small could undo years of certainty. She never forgot Lieutenant Powell's calm authority, Captain Morrison's blunt words, the simple kindness of strangers who called her nurse instead of enemy. War is often remembered for destruction, but sometimes its quiet revolutions are born in places no one notices at first. In clean operating rooms, in sterilized tools, in lessons shared between people who once stood on opposite sides of a battlefield. In the end, the captured nurses were not just prisoners, they were messengers. Their testimony became living proof of a truth far more enduring than any ideology. Medicine built on science and compassion will always outlast medicine built on hate.